Among your slew of average, fast-paced, high-octane modern shooters, there are those precious few which call themselves and strive to be realistic. Rainbow Six Siege and Arma stand out as good recent examples, and there are a whole host of other titles which claim the realism crown as well. Squad, Ghost Recon, Red Orchestra, Insurgency. However, what if I told you that before any of these games came out, there was a series which ran parallel to the original iterations of Rainbow Six, which was in some ways more direct and more complex than Rainbow, one which at its height rivals realistic shooters to this day. SWAT 4 was one of the defining games of my young adulthood, and there are good reasons that I hold every tactical shooter that I play up to SWAT as a sort of litmus test as to both their authenticity and tactical fun, and not many pass. In the last video, I went over the history of the Police Quest adventure games. Initially written and designed by a retired police veteran turned game designer, Police Quest had an almost humorously strong emphasis on following proper police procedure. Even though the Police Quest name died with SWAT 2, the legacy of that series carried through to the first-person shooter iterations of SWAT, SWAT 3 and SWAT 4. My personal experience starts with SWAT 3 back in 1999. In many ways, I was looking for an extension of the experience I had with Rainbow Six 2 and 3 with SWAT. I really had no idea what the game would be like, its history, anything like that. I was pleasantly surprised to find a game that was both like and unlike Rainbow. It was very similar to Rainbow Six 1 in appearance and UI elements. As a default, you didn't see your arms in front of you, as has become standard in first-person shooters, although you could toggle this on from the console and through mods. For most players, all you had was an aiming reticle appropriate to the type of firearm you were using, and a somewhat ponderous set of menus used to control your fellow officers. Unlike Rainbow Six, SWAT 3 didn't have any planning mode. You enter with your team and dynamically make decisions based on your available options. In a lot of ways, this was far more realistic and more action-focused than Rainbow Six, even up until the third game, which still had you basically planning AI pathways through maps you had a huge amount of intel on and then refining your plan when you ran into problems. Your element in SWAT 3 had essentially all the options your Rainbow team had, only they were to be planned out and executed on the fly, and that was both one of the greatest strengths of SWAT 3 at the time, and also one of the biggest reasons SWAT 3 is difficult for modern gamers to pick up. From a modern perspective, SWAT 3 is a fantastic tactics game, but a primitive shooter. The character models are blocky compared to a modern game. There's no on-screen weapon by default, and very little HUD information overall, and the friendly AI is almost entirely hand-controlled by a very realistic but also very clunky command system, which was like an entire DMV phone tree of commands for a 10-man squad in English and Espanol. From commands to stack up on doors, which weapons to use, to move forwards or backwards, fall in, mirror the corner, enter the room and use a certain grenade, and each of these for 2 different fire teams and 2 different engagement modes stacked under the same set of keys. So you're navigating through at least 2 menus with your number keys to control your squad as well as managing your own personal controls. It's almost the level of control you would expect out of a turn-based or dynamic pause strategy game rather than a first-person shooter. And if you think of the game as a realistic tactics game only from the first person, SWAT 3 is going to make a whole lot more sense rather than taken as a shooter. You often had to sit back and command your squad rather than participating in the firefights directly and trying, but failing, to multitask, especially when the AI didn't quite take to a certain order or was having difficulty with a certain doorway. Even at the time, I considered these to be overly complicated AI controls, but this was the first time SWAT had been a 3D FPS, and with that in mind, it turned out really well. The core concepts in the game were very intriguing. As a member of law enforcement, you have rules of engagement. You can't just enter a room and kill everybody inside. You have to at least try to make the criminals comply, and if they don't, you have an array of less than lethal weapons that can take them down without killing them. If you shoot a suspect without them having threatened you or a civilian, you're going to lose points down the road, and if you start shooting civilians, whether by accident or on purpose, then you're really in trouble. Bullets were a lethality problem as well as a solution to threats. When you're trying to shoot one person and one person only, you have to think about more than just accuracy. You have to be worried about over-penetration. You want your bullet to hit your target and stop there, not go through him and through the wall and into the next room and hit a hostage. SWAT 3's penetration model made you think carefully about what weapons and ammo to bring to engagements. The criminals aren't going to be as thoughtful. They'll happily spray way into a room with your squad in it and let the bullets hit what they may. It's your job to control these situations. Get intel on areas before you enter them. Make sure you bring the right weapon to the job and bring order to chaos. Despite being almost 2 decades old, SWAT 3 still has a very dedicated core audience, and for a good reason. In a lot of ways, it was ahead of its time, and there haven't really been any successors or replacements for it, other than the direct sequel, SWAT 4, which, believe it or not, is the subject of this video. In my opinion, SWAT 4 is the pinnacle of the series. Unfortunately, that's because it was the last game in the SWAT series made for the PC, and double unfortunately, it wasn't commercially available for years. This was because the license for the game got lost during the Vivendi-Activision merger, another trickling side effect from Sierra's acquisition by Koch decades ago. Fortunately for new fans and those of us who've lost our discs, GOG.com has been starting to sell copies again, and now you too can get into probably one of the best close quarters combat games of all time. So, what makes SWAT 4 so unique and interesting, and what makes it better than 3? Well, from the bourgeois visual aspect, SWAT 4 is a better looking game than 3, obviously, in the sheer number of polygons. You're seeing your gun model next to your face, and you've got much more information presented visually on the screen at any given time. Magazine count, ammo count, and fire mode, as well as a much bigger and more present injury indicator. It isn't Call of Duty Gold standard, however. There aren't any aim-down sights, there's no hit indicators, and there's no pure sprint, just fast walk and slow walk. But for most intents and purposes, SWAT 4 looks and feels like a slightly pre-modern shooter. The UI was also updated. Commands are context-sensitive rather than just out there constantly. You are navigating menus when you give orders, but they are way shorter, more concise, and only drop down when you need them. It is this element which, more than anything else, allows SWAT 4 to play far more effectively as a tactical shooter. I like my action games as much as I like my leading and decision making, and maybe that makes me a normie casual. However, the fact that I can lead my team, issue orders, and shoot it out with the bad guys all effectively at the same time pushes SWAT 4 beyond 3 in my opinion. Yeah, 3 had a bunch more cool stuff, like being able to drop glow sticks in rooms you've cleared, and SWAT 4 has a way more dumbed down materials system. You're not going to be able to shoot through any walls, just doors, and consequently stray bullets are far less potent. SWAT 3 still has a lot going for it, and if SWAT 4 maintained everything from 3 and refined it and added a little bit extra, maybe some more graphics on level 3, then it would be the perfect sequel. We can't always have exactly what we want, however, but SWAT 4 kept what it needed to. SWAT 4 retained the scale and objective purpose of every game in the series to date. It may be repeating information somewhat, but it really is the standout element of the series. As a member of law enforcement, you're not there to kill everything that moves. You can't shoot suspects unless they threaten you or a hostage. Every single other tactical game on the market has one-dimensional gameplay. Kill them all. The bad guys are smart, they're fast, they're well armed. Your challenge is to figure out how best to kill them all so that you, your team, and any bystanders don't also bite it. The SWAT series uniquely puts you in the role of law enforcement. Not international terrorist hunters, not extra-legal death squads, actual cops. This adds an entire other dimension to the close quarters urban combat. Breaching into a room with armed suspects is even more dangerous when you can't just shoot them in the back as they run. You can't shoot them if they don't give up right away. You can't shoot them if they look at you funny. You have to disorient, confuse, and overwhelm threats as much as possible and try to get them to stand down, and not all of them do. Many confrontations will not immediately escalate or de-escalate. You'll often end up in this limbo period where a suspect hasn't made up their mind yet, and you have to try and read whether they're going to try and fight, give up, or run away. You have to try and read their intentions and act accordingly. At this point, you can swap to a non-lethal tool, of which there are many: tasers, pepper spray, and the notorious pepper ball gun. Why notorious? Well, the pepper gun shoots little paintballs of OC spray at dudes, and they immediately start doing the ghost pepper challenge, but there's no milk in sight, and they're pretty much at your mercy until they clear their eyes, and they'll usually immediately surrender. And if not, more pepper balls in your eyeballs, bro! You don't have to worry about whether or not they're giving up, or if you might hit a hostage. Just spray away. The pepper gun is almost like cheating for at least the first 6 missions or so in the game. The later missions have the tangos wearing gas masks, removing any OC spray or ball effectiveness, and resulting in a pretty hard difficulty spike for those who relied on it until that point. When you suddenly have to make life or death decisions, SWAT 4 is more realistic and more mature. Your goal is to preserve life. Any deaths that occur are to be considered a small failure on your part. Instead of just targets to eliminate, tangos and SWAT are just people, sometimes scared, sometimes confused, or mentally disturbed, sometimes angry and violent, but still just people, not expendable cutouts to mow down. The rules of engagement create both a more complex and challenging combat experience, and also a level of mature emotional depth in a game with barely any story. Your role as a keeper of the peace also makes situations that in other games would be minor or trifling into real challenges that tax your situational awareness, positional awareness, shooting skills, and self-control. Each of the missions in SWAT 4 is far more low-key than other realistic shooters, which tend towards exoticism. Even series which claim the highest level of realism try to project the player into not only a bank robbery, but the apartment next to it, a rolling gunfight and cards afterwards, a shootout on the roof, the escaping yacht, the jungle island. They try to emulate action movies. It taxes the pacing of these games and mixes realistic mechanics with unrealistic situations. To help the player keep up, you gotta introduce regenerating health, giant boxes of munitions, and oh geez, you got shot, let me pick you up and dust off your boo-boos, all better now mechanics. The realism is chipped away and the pace is throttled up to the point where some realistic shooters and a standard science fiction or action game are barely distinguishable from each other. SWAT 4 doesn't try to emulate an entire action movie, just a single convenience store robbery gone wrong, a bank heist stalled by a vault timer, a cult set on blowing themselves up, just small slices, not entire films. You're not taking back entire oil tankers or underground bunkers, you're not shooting up the White House in order to save the president from ninjas. The widest the scope of SWAT 4 gets is a university research lab at the end of the base game and a warehouse at the end of the expansion pack. SWAT also doesn't make you an action hero and has you relying on AI teammates much more than in other shooters. Most modern shooters either make friendly AI immortal or eliminate it altogether. SWAT 4's AI is on a fragile balance point. They are very useful to the point of necessary in breaching rooms, since you can have one breach and one use a grenade while you cover them. And while they're moving, they do a great job of covering you. Like a human player, they have difficulty processing multiple targets at once. Getting flanked is as much of an issue for them as it would be for you. The AI also has difficulty processing non-complete silhouettes. A human could see a leg and the barrel of a gun sticking around the corner and fill in the rest of the picture in their head, but your squad won't. That makes certain spots like staircases and certain room breaches something you'll want to perform yourself. The AI will get stuck in these intermediate spaces and have way more difficulty than you would, and would probably get themselves all killed. They do excel at those fight-or-flight standoffs, however. The computer can read its own mind about fight or flight. You don't have to worry about them ever disobeying ROE. If the bad guy is planning to shoot, they'll usually know it before you do, and they'll pull the trigger in an instant. Using the AI is complex compared to some modern titles, but it's still quite usable and unique even for its time. It's a good mix of control and flow. The drop-down and contextual control were revolutionary for the time, and while they are a bit more verbose than you might see in a modern title, SWAT's pace allows for it. I don't think any modern title would ever try to be as slow as SWAT 4 is, and it's a shame. SWAT 4 is a brilliant example of careful, deliberate pacing done right. Knowing a single bullet could kill you, you are given the tools to progress cautiously. Check your corners, peek under doors, plan your movements, control the scene, and when you're ready, execute your plan. When the action starts, SWAT 4 is as fast and brutal as any modern shooter, but the fact that you've spent a minute of planning before that 15 seconds of action makes those 15 seconds even more exhilarating. SWAT's ebb and flow makes the slow planning tense and the fast action pulse-poundingly exciting, and that's rare for a modern title. Rainbow Six Siege is the closest in recent memory to do this. My only complaint about the mechanics of the combat comes from SWAT's age. SWAT relies on the very strict reticle expanding and contracting system that a lot of old tactical games of the era used. It makes it so that if you want to remain accurate, you'll have to move slowly. I don't mind this, but when it comes to room clearing, the AI will move at top speed, and they can make shots moving that fast, but you can't. You want to be able to keep pace, but if you do, your aim goes to shit. This conundrum is made a bit easier when you're playing with your friends. SWAT 4 still has a fairly functional co-op and versus multiplayer, although I would recommend the co-op more than anything else. I say fairly functional, because you're not going to get it to work just by running the game and clicking on the multiplayer tab. You will have to get a third-party program to handle the connection and matchmaking for you. We found that Game Ranger worked really smoothly for this, although you might want to do your own research in case there's something you like better, like forwarding ports for 2 hours. Just use Game Ranger. When playing with friends, SWAT 4 is a rough around the edges, but also simply incredible experience. You have to communicate very closely in order to make sure each room breach goes smoothly. Who's gonna throw the grenade? Who's gonna take point? Who's gonna go left, right, center? And who is covering your ass? Many games allows players to make a mistake or two, and when trouble does come, give time to swap equipment or roles in order to deal with it. If you're playing with your friends in SWAT 2, if you're not covering all your angles, somebody's gonna die, and then they're gonna have to watch the rest of the match from the sidelines. After you get your communication down, SWAT 4's co-op fulfills all fantasies about being on a super elite squad with your buddies. You take point, I'll support, flash, bang and clear, tango at 3 o'clock, gun, 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 he's not surrendering, hands up, drop your weapons, he's pointing, tango down, I'm hit but not bad, zip up the hostages and let them hang, boys, let's grab a cold one. It's really good and very fun, even though, again, it's a bit rough around the edges. It's worth every minute of getting a group of friends together and taking on the bad guys, one room at a time. The game's quality and fun make it all the more bittersweet that SWAT 4 has been the only game of its kind for more than a decade. Sadly, the market has moved away from games like SWAT, meaning another SWAT game being released by a mainstream AAA game developer would be unlikely. More than anything, I don't think you can get away with such a slow pace and humble scope and expected to get a lot of sales. There have been attempts, however. Takedown Red Saber was a memorable swing and a miss that had a promising Kickstarter but a failed execution. It was buggy, the AI was broken, and the game overall was unfinished on release, shattering the dreams of those of us who wanted a SWAT 5. More promisingly, Ready or Not looks like another swing at filling SWAT 4's shoes. The trailers and early gameplay footage will look really cool, and I'm very hopeful that Ready or Not will be the SWAT 5 we've been looking for. And I know exactly where being hopeful leads, however, so I'm not going to jump to any conclusions about a game likely in mid-alpha at this point. For my own sanity, I'm probably gonna block out any mention of the game until it's very near release. To help in that process, I'm just gonna list a few things that, if SWAT 5 or any other spiritual successor were made, would be stuff that I would do to bring the series into a modern game environment. Aim down sights would be a must, but it would have to be adjusted to fit SWAT's overall design ethos. The main reason the reticle dilation is so extreme is that they wanted to simulate the difficulty of maneuvering a long gun in tight spaces. In a SWAT 5, I would make the gun more of a physical object. While you're down ADS, if you're very close to an object, it gets knocked over, and if you try to turn into a wall or door frame, your gun gets blocked, so you can't turn it in that direction anymore, but the camera would keep going. When you're hip firing, your SWAT guy would maneuver the gun around obstructions. This would simulate, for example, being in a tight corridor and having to lower a long rifle to turn or go around doorways. A small SMG or pistol wouldn't be affected by this, however, and you could use aim down sights non-stop, albeit with lower stopping power, smaller magazine, or more barrel jump with shots. That would mean that transitioning to a pistol, something that SWAT 4 doesn't really do that much or very well, would be practical in these kinds of situations. I would also make transition from hip to ADS sloppier than in a normal shooter to discourage snapshots. Another instinct would be to introduce some sort of reasonable melee disarm mechanic. SWAT 4's expansion pack, the Stechkov Syndicate, played with this idea with a punch, which would push suspects and bystanders closer to compliance. However, I happen to know a few guys on my local SWAT team, and they made it clear to me that planning to disarm a guy with a gun is a bad idea. even if you had thrown tear gas into the room, even if you knew for a fact that the guy was blinded, having trouble breathing, and was as distracted, disoriented, and disabled as possible, making a plan to grab for his gun could lead to uncertain consequences. He could decide to just hammer on the trigger, spraying whoever the gun is pointing at. Bullets could go through walls, hit bystanders on the street. You could botch the disarm, get you or your team shot. In a real-life room entry, you would basically be doing what you do in SWAT 3 and 4. Distract from the room entry, take positions, down any aggressive targets, train weapons on armed, non-aggressive targets, and command compliance until it is given, or not. From a modern game design perspective, it's a bell and a whistle that would be requested, but to actually remain authentic, disarms would be a last resort for any officer in a room entry and should probably be left out. I also fully realize that a remake of SWAT, if done with realism, would be politically difficult. We are living in a time where sensitivity to realistic or politicized depictions of violence and actual events of domestic and international terrorism are both at an all-time high. While taking inspiration from real-world events is a shortcut to authenticity, it is also a shortcut to pissing people off about your interpretation of such events. Where SWAT did this, they made an attempt to arbitrage the situations enough to, let's say, diffuse the flack from any outraged parties. While a reboot of the SWAT series may have obstacles in its way, it would be well worth the trouble. Barring any future developments that may or may not blow our LBEs off, we have to stick with what we have. SWAT 4 in particular was a real gem, the like of which has not really been matched since. It even beats out Rainbow Six Siege in a couple of key areas. At the very least, get yourself to Good Old Games and pick up a copy. It may be short and slightly antiquated, but god damn is it ever good, and definitely worth your dosh.
Give me a minute, I'll let
Russian.
James, I'm gonna take the right of the room. You take the left, and then Ace will just cover us. Alright?
Okay, right. So, do you want me to look?
No, it doesn't require death. It doesn't seem like it requires anything.
It'd be nice if we could play this seriously in
Gotcha.
Siege.
3, 2, 1, breach. Damn. Alright, I'll pick it. No, I'll pick it. I'll pick it.